Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome you to our second Positive Links session of the fall. As I mentioned in our first one, our theme for this semester is positive organizing in health and the implications of the linking positive scholarship to health. Today I have the honor to introduce Sarah Pressman. She is assistant professor at the University of Kansas, and she has published numerous articles on positive emotion and physical health outcomes. She did her graduate work at Carnegie Mellon. In addition to her journal publication, she's world-renowned in the positive psychology community, and she's been in her local newspaper 3 times about her research. So, and Kim, luckily Kim, whatever Kim Cameron wants, he always gets. He promised her that it would be an Indian summer day here in Ann Arbor, and you see this is the only day that it hasn't rained in the last 5 days. So let's give Sarah a welcome. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the good weather. So I'm so pleased to see that you're here. It's always exciting to see different people getting interested in the health psych literature. And normally when I give this kind of talk, I have to spend some time encouraging people about why this is important. You know, sort of saying, oh, look, we've got all the answers already, because Oprah seems to know about happiness and health, and there's happy juice, and there's happy pills. And we've got, you know, apparently all the answers already, which obviously I think most of you realize isn't true, and that the pop psych sort of popular press literature is far beyond what the literature is saying. However, what I'm going to do today is really talk about what we do know so far, what some of my own research has shown, and sort of some ideas of where this can really go. And then hopefully at the end we can have sort of an interesting conversation together, talk about how this relates to organizations, because obviously this is something new for that field. So as far as the research reality goes, it turns out that if you did your standard PubMed search, your standard psych info search, and you looked up articles on something like depression and health versus happiness and health, you get about 100 times more studies on the negative affect piece. So there is work out there, but there's definitely a dearth of research on the sort of positive emotion field. And, you know, when I say 100 times, that's a gross underestimate of the difference, because a lot of the studies that had happiness in them, it wasn't the main focus. It wasn't really the main purpose of those studies. It just happened to be something that they measured at the same time. So what we're going to do today is talk about what positive affect is, and if there's any psychologists in the audience, you know, obviously this is a very loaded question, so we're going to take a very simple answer out of it. We're going to review some of the previous research and what the problems are with that literature, where we need to go from there, and then talk a little bit about what some of my own research studies have shown. I've got some data tying positive emotions to a longer life, and then really what are the pathways that let something like happiness get under your skin and actually make a difference? You know, what is it that's letting those feelings actually change our health in a meaningful way? Because as I'll show you from the literature, it really does seem like that's happening. Okay. So I promised a loaded question. I'm taking the easy way out. I'm taking a very broad definition. So the definition we're going to go with is one from Clark and Watson. They're the inventors of the PANAS, for those of you who are familiar with the PANAS, or the positive affect and negative affect schedule. And they say positive affect is feelings that reflect pleasurable engagement with the environment. And this can be anything. This can be happiness, it can be joy, it can be feeling calm, it can be feeling excited. And depending on what scale you choose, you're going to get very different words in your scale. So for example, if you did pick the PANAS, which is what Clark and Watson used, what they developed, they don't have the words happiness and joy in their scale, because that's not what they consider positive emotion. It's not how the scale was developed. They also don't have words like calm. You know, so you have to be very careful, again, when you're reading these studies, because positive affect isn't going to mean the same thing from study to study. To make it even more complicated is that it can be measured in different time periods. So you probably hear the words emotion thrown around, the word mood thrown around, the word disposition thrown around. And ideally, what we're talking about there is how long that feeling is lasting. So an emotion is typically considered to be a very transient state. Mood would be maybe a few minutes, possibly a few days, depending on who's measuring it. And trait is more long-lasting. This is how you are in general. It's your disposition. That being said, in the literature, these things are often used interchangeably. So, you know, you're going to see it mixed around a little bit. As far as what we think is important for health outcomes, it really makes the most sense to focus on trait. Because when you think about what's going to make the difference for how long you live 20, 30, 40 years down the line, it's not going to be how you feel right now in this talk. You know, this might be the best talk ever, hopefully, and, you know, you feel fantastic. But if you feel miserable, you know, 99% of the time, that's going to be what's more important than how you feel transiently. And in some studies, they do study, you know, a short-term emotional induction. So, I show you a funny movie, you get happy, I look at what happens. Well, what does that mean for your health? Because it's transient. But if I look at how you felt over the last year, that really could play a big role in how your health turns out, the physiological outcomes of what happens. And so this is really where we tend to focus when we think about, what makes the most sense, what should we be measuring when we're looking at health. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit just about a handful of studies that have been done that were fairly well designed that really do show the wide array of health outcomes that positive emotion seems to be important for. And if you're curious on this and you want more detail, my colleague Sheldon Cohn and I did 2 reviews on this, so these are the citations for those. Okay, so the most consistent evidence, and really there was almost no counter evidence to it, shows that positive emotion, again, typically measured more dispositionally, how you feel in general, predicts living a longer life. So just to give you an example, this is a study done by Levy in 2002, and they actually followed people for 23 years. So this is a really impressive longitudinal study. And it was prospective in that they controlled for positive emotion at baseline, and they covaried out all the possible things that could mess up that data. So things like their age, how functional they were, what was their health like, did they have other diseases. They covaried for all of those things and then saw how long these individuals lived. And it turns out that the individuals who had the highest levels of positive emotion, well, they were getting about a 7.5-year benefit. So that's nothing to sneeze at. That's a pretty substantial increase. And again, not due to their health. They weren't healthier at baseline. That's not what's going on here. It's something about them having these higher dispositional levels of feeling more positive. Okay, similarly, morbidity has great evidence. Again, no counter evidence at all. Every study that we looked at in our review showed a benefit. And this is across a wide array of outcomes. This could be, are you likely to catch a cold in the real world or in the lab? Are you likely to get a stroke? If you're a senior citizen, are you likely to fall? If you're a teenage hockey player, are you likely to get into an accident? Or how long do you stay in the hospital after something bad has happened? And really across the board, we saw benefits. Of course, there's the possibility of a file drawer effect where maybe some of the non-findings are not being published. But at least as far as what's published, we're seeing some really good evidence for people who are more positive, not catching different diseases, not having these different incidents. So one of the, and I'm obviously biased, but one really good example of this is the Pittsburgh cold study, which I was involved in. And this is where we bring people into the lab. So we bring them into a hotel, healthy as possible, and we actually experimentally expose them to a cold virus. So they lie down on a table, and we actually put droplets of the cold virus up their nose, follow them up for a week, and we see who gets sick. And we do this in a very objective way. It's not just, how do you feel? Do you think you have a cold? We actually look at, in their mucus, which I think you know what that means, in their mucus, are they actually secreting antibodies specific to the cold virus we gave them? And we also look at things like how much mucus are they producing. And we do this in a very lovely way where every time they blow their nose, they have to put it into a little bag. And then we weigh the bag and see how much they're producing. And it's great. They get paid well. And then we also do studies. We also look at other things like how stuffed up are they. So we put drops of dye in their nose and see how long it takes to travel to the back of their throat, which is an objective marker of congestion. We do all sorts of fun things to them. Anyway, the main point here is we measured their positive emotion before they came into the hotel. So before they came in and got exposed to this virus, we would call them every day, we would ask them about their feelings, and then we looked dispositionally, or at least, it's not disposition, but it was an average over about a month of time. Were they less likely to get colds? And that's exactly what you're seeing. And so about 35% of the people in this, it's really hard to see the color, I apologize for that, in this blue bar here, about 35% of them were getting an objective cold. So that means not that they're saying that they're sick, but that they're objectively producing that virus, producing more mucus, they're objectively more stuffed up. And that as their happiness level goes up, the most positive group, only about 20% of them are getting sick. And the interesting thing here, and this is an issue I'll keep coming back to, is that this was not true for negative emotion. Negative emotion was not associated with an increased likelihood of getting sick, but it was associated with thinking you were sick. So if you asked them if they had a cold, they thought they had a cold, but it wasn't necessarily true for their objective colds. Okay. There's also great evidence in the pain literature and the self-report symptom literature, sort of consistent with what I was talking about with the negative emotion and the symptoms, that if you're in a good mood, you feel less pain. You're able to withstand pain for longer periods. If I asked you how you were feeling, if you're in a good mood, you're going to feel better. And this is we're not really sure if this is just perception. Is this real physiological data, or is this just you're distracted, your attention is different. When you're negative, you're sort of more self-focused, versus when you're positive, maybe you're externally focused. There are potential physiological mechanisms. You've probably all heard of like endorphins. So endorphins are our natural painkillers. They go up when we're happy, in theory. It hasn't really been well studied yet. So there are possibilities. Opioids change, but we haven't really tested that at that point. So we don't know to what extent this consistent finding is due to a physiological effect or just a psychological effect. Either way, obviously very important. Pain is a major issue in our society, especially back pain. It affects something like 80% of the population at some point in their life. So it is important. Okay, the most inconsistent data, and it's the real unfortunate sort of finding from our review, is that the survival literature is a bit messy right now. So this is cases where you have someone with cancer, you have someone with AIDS, you have someone with some end stage of a disease. If you can make them feel happier, or if they are naturally more positive, are they going to survive longer? And I'll show you one positive finding. So this is a population from Judy Moskowitz at UCSD, where they had men with HIV/AIDS, aged 25 to 34, controlled again for all the different sort of antiretrovirals they were on, all the baseline disease level differences like CD4 counts. And then they followed them up for a period of 7.5 years, and again, wanted to see who was still alive after that period. And what they were seeing is that those individuals who were the most positive had about an 18% decreased probability of mortality. So that was quite good. Unfortunately, this is not how all the studies look. And, as far as we can tell, and again, there's only about maybe a dozen of these studies, the ones that are looking at diseases with longer prognoses, so early stage breast cancer, early stage HIV, you are seeing benefits there. And that kind of makes sense physiologically because those diseases are just starting and there's a bit of room to move. You maybe could improve their immune function at a level that would be meaningful. You maybe could improve their cardiovascular function at a level that would be meaningful. When you get to diseases with high short-term mortality rates, so stage 4 breast cancer where you've got metastases, or end-stage renal disease where your kidneys have basically shut down, you're not seeing benefits. And it's not that surprising given that, as happy as we are, we can't rebuild a kidney. That's just not going to happen. And so at some point, the physiological processes, outstrip what positive emotion can do for you. But that being said, that doesn't mean that quality of life isn't going to be affected, and it's not going to say that, interventions at this level aren't important. It just might not keep you alive longer. So obviously, we need a lot more research in this area. Okay. So I've shown you some very positive, sparkly, happy findings. And if I had a magic 8-ball and I shook it, I'd like to say, sign points to yes. Positive emotion, always great, always perfect, always wonderful. But more realistically, it's more like better not tell you now, which is always the worst thing when you shake your magic 8-ball and you get that. And the reason, and what we say in the reviews that we've written is this is provocative evidence, but it's not definitive because there's not that much of it. We're not talking about thousands of studies. We're talking about handfuls of studies with each outcome. And there's issues with measurement and design that we're going to talk about now that sort of give us a reason to pause and just sort of say, okay, we need to do some better studies. We need to do some more specific designs. So one issue is what type of positive emotion. So I sort of alluded to you at the beginning when we talked about what it was, that there's all these different scales, and everyone's got a different idea about what items should go in there. And that makes it very hard to compare studies. So we've got these multiple item scales with, maybe 20 positive items, 30 positive items, versus sometimes in a lot of these studies, one single item saying, how happy are you? And then we follow them for 23 years and see that it's a benefit. But that's a very, non-scientifically valid. Obviously, it's got face validity. But, as far as, is this going to be highly correlated with a 50-item scale, that data is not necessarily there. Different people are going to have different reasons for why they're going to report certain answers to those questions. And typically, this is more done in a large-scale epidemiological study where someone just thought, hey, we should throw this in. So they weren't really thinking at the beginning, this is a great way to measure happiness. However, we are still seeing benefits. But it does make it very hard for us to compare these studies. Something that's been more popular recently with the sort of onslaught of sort of positive psych hype and excitement is that people will go back to scales that weren't originally designed to assess positive affect, take the positive items out, and then use that as a positive affect scale. So this has become very common. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the CESD, for example. This is like a very common depression scale. Well, 4 of the items are reverse coded. So instead of saying how depressed are you, it says how happy are you, and then you would reverse code that. So they'll take those items that are positively worded and use that as a positive emotion scale with great, wonderful, findings showing that, there's benefits to the positive emotion. But again, those scales weren't designed to do that. So it makes it very tricky for us to assess that. Some studies ask about your happiness about something. So how happy are you about your job? How happy are you about getting older? How happy are you about getting pregnant? And then they look at those kinds of outcomes. And again, this is something slightly different because no longer are we looking at their disposition. We're looking at some picture of some component of their life and how they feel about that. Again, not necessarily correlated with their disposition, but they have seen some interesting effects of it. The affect balance scale I'll get to in a minute when we talk about another issue with negative affect. But these are scales where there's negative on one side and positive on the other, and you have to put yourself somewhere in the middle. And that's got problems, which I'll talk about in a minute, about the independence between negative and positive emotion. And then finally, there's this issue that we have a lot of other positive traits. We've got things like self-esteem, things like perceived control and mastery, optimism, many of which have been shown to be important for health, but don't necessarily answer our question about positive emotion. And so when these kinds of things are in there, for example, in the CESD scale, they have the self-esteem item, which is considered positive emotion, which I'm sure many people who are experts here would argue is not the same thing. Self-esteem is not, they're correlated, but it's not the same thing as positive emotion. Okay, so here's where the affect balance scale comes in. And this is the idea that, we have a ton of research showing that negative emotion is bad for us. Hostility is bad for us. It leads to heart disease. Depression is bad for us, bad for a number of reasons. Type A behavior, stress, all these things have been for a long time known to be very bad for our health. And it could be that any benefit we're seeing with the positive emotion is just the opposite of that. That when we're seeing the benefit of positive, it's just the absence of negative that's driving that. And because of that, it's really essential that we start controlling for both. So if you're doing a study on one, that you're measuring the other, you can look at the relative effect sizes, you can see whether or not they're independent from each other. A lot of studies don't do that. They just leave that part out completely. Maybe they didn't even measure it. And I would say from both sides, the negative affect studies don't measure positive. The positive studies don't measure negative. And it's really important since we do know that in a lot of scales, these are very highly correlated. If I feel happy right now, what's the chance that I'm feeling really depressed right now? Negative correlation. On the other hand, the one thing we have going for us in terms of independence of these variables is Ed Diener has done some research showing that as your measurement time increases, the correlation between these things decreases. So if you think back over the last year, for example, and you think about all the happy things that have happened to you and all the bad things that have happened to you, those are relatively independent of one another. And that's really what we see in the literature, is that if I gave you a dispositional measure, your positive and your negative emotions are going to be a lot less correlated than if I gave you a state measure of how you're feeling right now. And that is hopeful for us studying health because we know that the disposition is what we're really interested in. And so to some extent, we hope for some independence there. But at the least, statistically controlling for it, covariating them, looking at the relative effects is a really important factor. Okay, something that hasn't really been considered too much in the health literature is this issue of activation. And so this is one model of positive and negative emotion that's been used frequently in various forms called the circumplex. And in this particular case, the two components of emotion are whether or not it's aroused or what the valence level is. In this particular model, they actually consider these things to be negatively correlated with each other, but ignore that for now. What we're really interested in is the idea that activation might be something particularly important for health. Because you can imagine, even if you know nothing about physiology and the heart, that feeling excited, what do you feel? You feel your heart race, you feel your blood pump. That's going to be very different in terms of how it affects your health than feeling really calm, where your blood pressure is dropping, maybe your body temperature is getting a little more warm and you're more sleepy. Those kinds of effects in your body could be very, very different. And it's really important for us to be considering that because if we're going to design, for example, an intervention to try to make someone healthier, well, we better know what we're activating, what's the most important component, because the intervention that's going to increase something like feeling excited is going to look really different than an intervention to make someone feel calm. And we better know which one we're supposed to be doing. And, the research really isn't out there yet, but my suspicion is that it's going to really depend on what disease you're looking at and what you want to improve. Okay, and just to make it even more complicated is this issue of perceived health. So I talked about how, most of the longitudinal studies are going to be controlling for health at the beginning, just to make sure that, any benefit you see from positive emotion, it's not just because those people were healthier when they started out the study. It's actually something about the emotion. Well, the trick comes in where when you're measuring perceived health, one of the more common measures is something called the SF-36. And they use words like vigor as a measure of health. And vigor is a word that we would knock in right into that activated area. So the question here is something that Albert Schweitzer said, which is, happiness is nothing more than good health and a bad memory. Which, to some extent might be true, because if we've got words that are talking about health, that are words like feeling vigorous and feeling full of pep, which are words that both positive emotion scales and health scales are using, are we just getting at the same thing? That healthy people are happier, happy people are healthier, these are exactly the same thing. And so in all of our studies, we better be controlling for this. We better be making sure that the health is not what's driving any effect. Okay, so here's the framework we came up with. There's actually two, but this is the first one. This would be a direct effects model. And like I said, we're trying to figure out how is positive emotion going to get under your skin and actually lead to something like a longer life or a different disease outcome. And the different pathways we think are going on, and the arrows are definitely bipolar, but we're just showing them in one direction for the sake of this study. If you're a more positive person, you're going to care more about your health. You're going to engage in more positive health practices. So this is stuff like you're going to get enough sleep at night. You're going to maybe watch your diet a little bit better, take a little bit more time to exercise. We also know that social ties, people who have more positive relationships have better relationships. And people who have better and more relationships tend to engage in better health practices. You've got your spouse to nag at you and say, hey, you should be eating better, you shouldn't be drinking so much. This is a very real association. Similarly, if you've got good social ties and if you've got more positive emotion, it's going to lead to better physiological activity. And that's some of the data I'm going to show you today, which is stuff like your autonomic activity, so your blood pressure, your heart rate, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. Let's just call it HPA. This is where your stress hormones come in. Those are both known to have very real effects on how your immune system works, how your heart works, and of course, those things can lead to disease. The thing in gray here, the unstudied pathways, these are things that people are studying a little bit now. There's maybe 1 or 2 studies showing that positive mood leads to endorphins. Oxytocin is a hot hormone right now, and I'm actually doing some work on that right now, and we can talk about that at the end. But it's in gray because the data is just not there yet. Okay, so let's try to resolve some of these issues that I mentioned as far as activation levels, perceived health issues, independence of positive and negative emotion. And so what we're looking for in a study, if we wanted to design the perfect study, we want to make sure that we're getting at both the positive and the negative emotion. We're going to want to make sure that we're getting that effect size, or at least, are they independent of one another? We're going to look at those active ingredients. Is there one type of emotion that seems to be the most important? And then we're going to control for closely related non-emotion constructs, things like optimism. And obviously, just for the sake of having a good study design, in the ideal situation, you want to have these prospective studies because of the sort of known cross-sectional associations where if you're feeling healthy, you're going to feel more happy and vice versa. And because of that issue with activation and the vigor words, we're going to want to control for health as much as possible. Okay, so the first and arguably one of the more important health outcomes is how long you live, and so that's going to be the first thing we look at. So this is a study that I did on famous psychologists. And for those of you who are familiar with the Nun study, this is going to sound a little familiar, but slightly different. So what we did here was we looked at 96 primarily male Caucasian subjects who were all famous psychologists. They were all deceased at the time of study. And I'll tell you how we did that in a second, how we looked at their positive emotions since they're already deceased. They were about 67 at baseline, 79 at time of death. And they were born in the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. So what we did, so how do we get at their positive and negative emotion? Well, what we did is we went to their autobiographies. So there's a 7-volume series called A History of Psychology and Autobiography. And what we were able to do was to digitally extract all these words. So we just scanned every page of their autobiography and used a computer program that could go through every one of those pages and look for specific words that we were interested in. So they were able to specifically look at words like vigor versus calm versus excited, and at the same time look at some of these other variables we're interested in. So why study life story writing? Well, first, this was my dissertation work, and these people were dead, and I didn't have time to study them for 23 years and still get my PhD. So this was convenient. But there's other reasons to study writing, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with the narrative research. I mean, life stories are very interesting. And positive emotion specifically really is known to suffer from the influence of social desirability. People very much want to say that they're happy, especially when you ask them on the spot. For example, this is some Gallup data, showing that if you look at how many people on a phone interview are likely to say that they're not very happy, not much. About 8% of people. Everyone else in the country is very to quite happy. Well, I think we could say that the depression statistics in this country would argue against only 8% of the people not being happy, since about 80% of people report serious stress at any given time, and about 1/4 of Americans are at least mildly depressed at some point. And obviously these statistics vary from year to year. I think this year is probably a particularly depressed year, so the statistics might look a little different here. But, that being said, it's a loaded question. Also, the nice thing here is that the writers don't even know they're under investigation. They're all deceased. They were writing their autobiographies for other purposes, to document, their lives, and, they don't know what we're interested in. And finally, like I said, there's a lot of interest in narratives. Well, autobiographies are really potentially an interesting thing to sort of get at how someone sees their life. When they think about everything that they've gone through, this might be a particularly nice way to get at a dispositional measure, because, they're really evaluating their entire life, not just how they felt over the last week or how they feel right now. And I'll give you some examples of what some of the autobiographies look like, but it's really surprising. You would think that everyone would want to sort of put themselves on a positive note in these autobiographies, and people are very willing to be negative and talk about bad things that have happened to them. For those of you who are familiar with psychology literature, these are some of the authors, some of the psychologists in the study. So you might recognize some of the names, like Piaget is pretty well known, and Skinner's in there with the Skinner rats, and so you might recognize a few of them. Needless to say, they're all psychologists, they're all male. Although some of them you could argue weren't necessarily psychologists. Margaret Mead is in there, which is, on the fence. She's more anthro, but regardless, she's in there. Okay, so what were the words we were interested in? Well, again, we wanted to get at that activation level. And so we wanted to make sure we had words like feeling lively and energetic, so that we could contrast them with words like feeling calm or content, so the activated versus the unactivated. And then similarly on the negative side, feeling stressed and tense and upset versus feeling tired and passive. So we had different dictionaries that would be automatically scanned through those autobiographies to see how many times people would use those words. We also created dictionaries looking at, some of these other characteristics of positive psych that we might be interested, or negative psych, feelings like loneliness and anxiety, mastery, gratitude, and so forth. And then the really fun part of that research was that we had to hand count their health words, because people talk a lot about diseases in their families. So my mother got cancer, my dad got prostate cancer, my dad got lung cancer. We had to make sure that they were talking about themselves. So we had to hand go through these and see how many times they actually brought up their own health. And it did turn out that that was associated with how long they lived. So it worked out pretty well. And that was the best measure of baseline health we could really get. Okay, so was emotional style associated with how long they lived? I think you can guess, given that I'm talking about it right now. And what we see is that the individuals who are using more of those activated positive words, this bar right here, that those individuals are living to about 82 years versus the individuals who are using those words less frequently, and they're living to about 76 and a half. So we've got, about a 5-year difference between these groups, a little bit more than that. Similarly, for the activated negative words, so these are words like, feeling tense and anxious, those people are dying sooner if they're using more of those words than the people who are using those words less often. And, in these analyses, they've done continuously. I'm just showing them as a high versus low for the sake of the graph. And we're controlling for their sex. We're controlling for their date of birth. We're controlling for what year they wrote their autobiography. Okay. So just to give you an example of people who are particularly happy or unhappy, this is Margaret Mead, and just an example of sort of a positive autobiography script. Everything we did was related comparatively to the past, vigorously and ethically to the present, and hopefully to the future that was in the making. By the spring, after lying awake all night in the excitement of genuine vocational choice, I decided to take a master's in psychology. So you can really feel this is a very positive, very active autobiography. And just to contrast that with someone who is high and negative, This is Thorndike, I believe. Noise does not disturb me unless it is evidence of distress, as of a person or animal in pain. Social intercourse, except with intimate friends, is fatiguing, and all forms of personal conflict, akin bargaining, persuading, or rebuking, are triply so. You know, this isn't his published autobiography. He's saying that he hates everyone. You know, people are tiring. They hate everything is really a pain in the butt, and that, you know, he doesn't noise doesn't really bother him too much. So really a different feeling between these two autobiographies. And so the constant sort of question that people say is, you know, if you're digitally coding these, we don't really know if the person is saying I am in distress or I was feeling happy. But even without that, you know, this is not him saying I am in distress, but you can still feel that negative flavor. So it's the words that they choose that seems to be very important, not necessarily them saying I'm feeling this way. Okay. The unactivated emotions didn't do anything, and this is going to be something you should look for because this is going to be echoed in a lot of my other research, which is that feeling calm or feeling tired doesn't really seem to be buying us too much in health, and certainly in this case it didn't buy us anything. Now, as far as these confounds we talked about, you know, what happens if we create a multiple regression equation and we include all of these different variables together? You know, what are we going to see that these two factors are independent from one another? And what we actually see is that only the positive affect maintains its association with how long you live. So it's actually the positive affect piece that seems to be driving that negative association originally. And once you control for the positive piece, you lose the negative emotion piece there. So at least in this case, the happiness, the activated positive emotion seemed to be what was driving the association. What if we control for some of those other positive constructs we talked about, feelings like optimism or esteem, extroversion? In this case, only extroversion was, of these variables, the one that was associated with how long you lived. And again, if you control for all these factors in the same equation, include positive affect with it, well, it doesn't seem to be going. There we go. What we're seeing is that, again, the association persists. You don't lose any of the original effect size. And then finally, if you control for those health words that we talked about that I hand-coded, you again still see that the positive emotion is persisting. It's still associated with how long these individuals live. And really, in some cases, it's actually improving the fit of the equation. So it's actually explaining more variability of mortality. Have any of you ever heard this? Laughter is the best medicine. Hasn't really been tested that yet. And so we tested it. And so we created a dictionary that said chuckle, laugh, funny, humor, giggle, funny, silly, jolly, and so forth, words that sort of represented humor and laughter. And what you see is not too surprising based on this statement, which is that the people who use those words even one time, if they mentioned it once in their autobiography, they're getting about a 7-year benefit on how long that they're living. So really a whopping effect. And we can't wipe this out with anything. If we do all the same confounds, all the same effects, if we control for positive activated emotion, you still see this. So really kind of a nice little piece there. Okay. So we've shown you, I talked about how the social relationship piece is really important. You know, social relationships and positive affect are unfortunately frequently ignored in the whole positive psych literature. Just like the way that the positive psych researchers kind of ignore the negative piece of it, they also tend to not necessarily talk too much about relationships, and vice versa is also true. Relationships folks don't talk about emotion. But we do know that positive affect is consistently associated with having more friendships, more relationships, bigger social support networks, more perceived social support, and vice versa. If you have a good social network, you're happier. This is a very consistent, very strong finding. Both of these are very well known to be associated with health. For example, House did a review that's very well cited from 1988 where he showed that being socially isolated is an equivalent risk factor to smoking in terms of how long you live. So very real, very strong effect. Similarly, I've done some of my own work. We've shown that if you're isolated and lonely, you don't respond to the flu vaccine very well. So you should always be very happy going into your flu vaccination this week. Because I hear it's like right now, I think it's today. So go in feeling great because stress impacts your vaccination, loneliness, isolation, sleep, all sorts of stuff. We can talk about that at the end if you're curious. I can give you some very specific advice. Okay, so if we go back to our autobiographies, are we going to see the same thing? Is it the case that social relationships words, so if I write my autobiography and I'm spending the whole time talking about myself, is that going to look different than someone who talks about their spouse and they talk about their partner and their mother and their father and their grandfather and their, co-author and so forth? And what we see is a nice linear relationship where the people who talk about their relationships in their autobiographies are the people who talk about them least are the ones who are living the least long. So 76 versus about 83 for the people who are talking about that in a longer period. It turns out that the positive emotion and the social relationships in this case were actually independent of one another. So you put them into the same equation, they're both still predicting. So that was nice. I don't know if that would be true if we were looking at a real-time study. I mean, obviously this is life stories. This is a little bit different. But the nice thing is that we've actually been able to replicate this in a population of famous literary authors. So the social relationship effect was still there. Okay. So let's start talking about physiology. And I'm going to say, feel free to interrupt me because I know a lot of you don't have a medical background. So if there's anything that you're like, why would you study that? Feel free to lift up your hand and I can explain it to you. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is salivary cortisol. This is a stress hormone that got a lot of attention. Some of you might have heard of like Relacor. This is like a diet pill that's supposed to attack your cortisol. That's why it got a lot of attention recently. Well, as far as cortisol, it's a regulatory hormone. We all have it. It shoots up first thing in the morning, about 45 minutes after you get up, decreases throughout the day. It'll go up in little bunches as you get stressed, as you eat your lunch. It's associated with suppressed immunity, which is why we're really most interested in it. When you have very high levels of it, or if your rhythm gets dysregulated so that you're not starting high in the morning and going down, but maybe you go up and stay up, then at that high level, you're actually turning your immune system off. And the reason behind this is really the whole fight or flight response, which we could go into for a long time. Essentially that, when your cortisol is up in the evolutionary path, this was so that you could run away from the lion that was chasing you. So you're diverting your energy to your muscles and your periphery. You don't want your immune system on because you don't need that to run away. This is something I could talk about for an hour, so I'm going to try to not go into it for too long. Essentially, this is why people have been really excited about it, is a suppressed immune function thing. Typically, we've been studying it in these very short-term stress reactivity studies where we bring people into the lab, stress them out, and then see what happens to their cortisol. It's very easy to measure. You can actually do it with saliva, and so this has also increased its popularity. And there's been a lot of studies showing that, even outside of the lab, if I look in the real world, people who have higher negative emotion, higher stress, especially things like perceived post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic depression, those people tend to have very high flat levels of cortisol, which is obviously bad for their immune system. Again, constant suppression. Okay, so the question is, what's the role of positive affect in this cortisol rhythm? And so we looked at this with a population of about 83 healthy university freshmen. They were primarily Caucasian. This is at Carnegie Mellon. We collected salivary cortisol from them 4 times over 5 days. And while we were doing this, they were collecting mood measures with daily diaries. So they carried around a Palm Pilot, and it would beep them and say, how happy are you feeling right now? How stressed are you feeling right now? And it would also tell them, take your saliva sample right now. And we had these little timestamp codes to make sure that they were actually doing it at the right time. And so they did that over the surrounding period, and this is what that looked like. So we followed them for 2 weeks. For 5 of those days, we were getting salivary cortisol. The only reason we only did it for 5 was just a cost issue. So what we were able to do was look at how, their feelings, their mood, and their affect, their negative and positive affect levels over this period was associated with what their immune-suppressing stress hormones were looking like. And this is just what if you're interested in doing this work yourself at some point, this is what a salivette looks like. And so all it really is this cotton dental roll like you get at the dentist's office when they're trying to sort of separate your gum out from your teeth. They just put that into their mouth for about a minute or 2, put it right back in the tube, carry it with them, bring them into the lab whenever you want them to. Pretty stable at room temperature, so they don't even need to throw this into the refrigerator or anything. They can just carry it with them. Okay, so again, we got at the different quadrants of activation. So we were getting at their depression, their anxiety, but also their fatigue. We were getting at their well-being, but also their vigor and their calm. So we're getting the whole spectrum of activation levels. In this case, we really wanted to control for stress because it is a stress-reactive hormone. So we wanted to make sure that we're not just controlling for them feeling depressed or anxious, but also their specific stress levels. And for these analyses that I'm going to show you their average state trait measure over those 2 weeks. But we also have done some structural equation models looking at the effects from day to day. So if you're curious about that, I can tell you about that as well. So this is what it looked like. So this is, again, the average over a 1 week or over a 5-day period. And what you're seeing is that the blue line, the people who are the least happy, the least positive, that those individuals are starting out fairly normal, but throughout the day, when they're supposed to be going down, so this would be a healthy rhythm going down throughout the day, they actually flatten out. And so you start seeing a flatter slope in that least positive group, which again, you want to have that decrease because at very high levels, immune suppression. And as far as the importance of this health-wise goes, there's been studies showing now that people who have flatter slopes, for example, breast cancer patients, that they actually die sooner if they have a flat slope. So this has had some very real health outcomes associated with cortisol, although, albeit, there's only been a few of them in human studies like that. Interestingly, negative emotion didn't do anything. So you're not seeing any effect there. They're basically all looking pretty much the same, statistically insignificant. And very surprisingly is that you didn't actually see it for stress either. So, in a natural, healthy population of undergraduates, even stress wasn't having the same impact on this stress hormone the way that we would expect it to, and that it really was the lack of positive emotion. And what we really think is going on here is that when we were sampling these people, the only time that we could get them to take a Palm Pilot and carry it around with them for 2 weeks was when it wasn't exams, when it wasn't finals. And so it was a particularly low stress time for these college students. That being said, we see plenty of stress variability. It's probably just not as extreme as it could get if we had sampled them during exam time. Carnegie Mellon students, very stressed during exam time. I have no doubt they would show immune suppression, no problem. All right, so if we statistically control for negative emotion stress, again, not too surprising since they weren't significant, you maintain the association between positive emotion and cortisol. So not wiped out by these confounds. And similarly, if we look at things like we talked about, self-esteem, mastery, extroversion, health, which is what we get with our average symptom report, not wiping out that association. And then if we look at what the active components are, a little bit different than what we saw with the autobiographies, we're seeing a marginal effect of vigor, but really it seemed to be the happiness and the sort of pleasant feelings that were driving this association. But once again, calm was not doing anything. Calm was not predicting their stress hormone levels. All right, people laughed at the kitten. I spoiled it. Okay, so one possible unique role for positive emotion and health is in the stress response. So far we've been sort of talking about more main effect things, positive emotion directly leading to health benefits. But it's also possible that the reason that positive emotion is good for us is because it helps us wash away all the bad stuff that stress does to us. So this has been proposed by Bob Levinson in 1988 that, maybe positive emotion is good because it's able to undo the autonomic stress response. And Barb Fredrickson did some of this work here a few years ago, showing that if you bring people into a lab, you show them a funny movie, a little happy movie, that you can actually improve their cardiovascular recovery. So their arousal, it decreases faster than if they see a more neutral movie or if they see a negative movie. Similarly, if they spontaneously smile during the stress task, that also speeds up their cardiovascular recovery. But again, both of these are momentary. So we're not looking at the disposition, the sort of natural emotion that might be more important for health, but it's obviously very important, very telling. So this is the model we came up with for what we think is going on as far as the stress buffering model. And so positive emotion can play a role at a few different places. If you're a more positive individual, you might not actually perceive that event as stressful in the first place. So you might even not experience that as a stressor because two people can experience the exact same thing. One person thinks it's stressful, one person doesn't, because of differences in personality and resources and so forth. It's also possible that these individuals have different resources, which goes with Barb Fredrickson's broaden and build theory. This idea that there's these social and psychological things that people who are more positive build up, and that maybe that is also helping them with the stress response. And then it's also possible that, sure, you respond to the stress. You identify it as a stressor and your blood pressure goes up, but maybe you get over it faster. So maybe it's going to help you recover from it faster as well. And so I'm going to just show you a few things where we test this theory. Basically, really trying to hone at this immediate area, looking at the health practices in the autonomic areas and the HPA areas. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is physiological differences, looking at the cardiovascular response to stress. Why are we interested in this? Well, big important reasons. How someone responds in a lab is actually known to predict whether or not they develop heart disease down the line, whether or not they get a heart attack down the line. And people tend to be very stable. This is almost like a personality trait. If you are a lab reactor or your blood pressure shoots up when I make you give a speech, that's how you are. It's very stable. It's very hard to change those people. And we know that those reactors are likely to develop new clinical events down the line. Interestingly, on top of this, how you recover additionally predicts your likelihood of developing things like blood pressure change and hypertension down the line, and that's if you get over it. So if you're stressed, do you malinger over it? Are you constantly thinking about it? Can you knock it out of your mind? Or do you just put it out of your head and recover right back down to where you were before? And those turn out to be a little bit different in terms of their predictive ability. So in this study, we looked at 217 women in Pittsburgh, around 63 years old, and we got rid of the smokers. Again, control for their health as best we can, so we can account for things like their body mass index, their race, their age, their baseline cardiovascular function. So were they coming in with high blood pressure? We made sure we controlled for that very well. And again, we looked at the different quadrants of emotions. So we're getting at the anxiety, depression, anger versus the high and low activation, positive emotion. In this case, we're using a version of the PALMS that's been factor analyzed and shortened a little bit. And again, in this case, it wasn't perfect. We weren't doing it over their entire lives, but they were reporting their natural experience of emotion over the last week. So 0 would be never, 4 would be always. And B.S. Skinner, who was one of my subjects, he says, we know that emotions are useless. We know that they're bad for our peace of mind and our blood pressure, so I'm hoping to prove him wrong, that at least the positive emotions are not so useless. And so hopefully we'll see that. Okay, so this is what the task looked like. They came in, we controlled for all their baseline different measures, and then we put them through 3 very nasty stress tasks. Us health psychologists, we're just nasty. First thing we make them do, and this is counterbalanced, is something called a star tracing task. So this is where your left hand or your non-dominant hand is put in a box so you can't see it. There's a mirror in there so you can see your hand through a mirror, and you're asked to trace a star, and every time you go off the border, it buzzes at you. And you tell these people something like, we're gonna pay you less every time you go off the border. So it's very irritating. People who are perfectionists especially hate it. We then make them give a speech. We give them a scenario, something like you're defending yourself in traffic court against a parking ticket or a speeding ticket, and we tell them they're being evaluated. We have someone in the room who looks angry, who's rating them, and we've got a video camera. They also hate that. Most people, public speaking is their #1 fear, so that's a pretty consistent use in health psych literature. And then finally, just to top it all off, we make them hold a bag of ice on their forehead. Very uncomfortable, very painful. They only have to do it for a minute. But the nice thing about this is we could look at stress reactivity across 3 different stressors, and these are known to have very different physiological patterns of response. See if the positive emotion generalizes against these for reactivity. And then in the case of the cold pressor, we could actually look at recovery because it was the last task, and we could see if these people were getting over it faster, if they were more positive to begin with. This is just an idea of the timing, so you have a sense. We were measuring heart rate throughout the whole thing, blood pressure about every 2 minutes, and they had about 15-minute breaks between the different tasks as they went through it. And each of the tasks was a couple minutes long. The cold pressure is only a minute because it's that painful, that most people can only put up with it for about that long. Okay, so what we found, oh, did I skip a slide? No. Okay, what we found with the recovery, and I'll show you what this looks like in a minute, is that positive emotion was associated with across blood pressure, so systolic and diastolic blood pressure and heart rate, that more positive people were getting over it faster, but that negative emotion was not associated with recovery, and including it had no impact on that initial equation. So this is what it looked like for diastolic blood pressure. I could have given you heart rate or a systolic. They all look pretty much the same. But what you're seeing is that the high positive people in yellow, the stressor was happening, right at this y-axis, so a minute before, that almost immediately, after 1 minute, they were dropping down to about their baseline level. So the standard diastolic blood pressure level, usually a little bit lower than this, but they were getting close. And these are a population of 6-year-old women. And so this is pretty close to what their baseline levels were. Whereas the people who were low in positive affect, basically not recovering. They were just staying high, possibly, perseverating on what just happened to them, these 3 nightmare stress things, and they're just still dwelling on it, and their blood pressure is just not going down, which is obviously very important in our real lives because, these stressful things are happening to us on a day-to-day basis, constantly in your office, and if you're not happy, that stressor is going to stay with you. You're not getting over it. Similarly, if we look at the recovery, for the cold recovery, what the active component of it was, once again, we're seeing that the high activation piece is what was driving that, which is really surprising because when you think about what's going to help you get over stress, you would think it's going to be feeling calm, right? You feel calm, it's going to let you sort of go right back down, and in this case, that wasn't it. It was feeling vigorous and enthusiastic and energetic. Again, you can control for their fitness. You can control for their baseline health. We have a lot of measures of health in these people. Didn't wipe it out. Wasn't due to their social relationships. Wasn't due to any of the sort of positive confounds that we talked about before, the other positive constructs. So something really unique about, high activated positive emotion, this energy feeling that really seems to be doing something for our physiological health. Similarly, if we look at the 3 different stress tasks, so the first one is the STAR task here. I'm having a hard time locating this. Let's use this instead. The STAR task here versus the speech task versus the cold pressor task. The blue bars are the people who are low in positive emotion, and you can see that in every case, they are showing higher levels of reactivity to these 3 different tasks than people who are lower in positive emotion, the yellow people, especially with the cold pressor. I mean, this is pretty dramatic. So in this case, this is systolic blood pressure. You probably all know that, what you want with systolic is something like 120/85 or so. So these people are already definitely reacting. I mean, everyone's showing an increase, but the people who are the low in positive affect, they're showing, a massive, almost dangerous increase. I mean, once you get to 150, 160, I mean, that's a very substantial increase in their blood pressure. Okay, so again, nothing with negative affect. Controlling for it had a negligible impact on positive emotion. Vigor was the only subcomponent responsible, once again surprising, because you would think that how much you respond to stress, would be really helped by feeling calm. And again, this is not what's happening. It's feeling energy. It's feeling activated. Physical fitness, not wiping it out. Social relationships, not wiping it out. So same story. Same story as the cortisol, same story as the recovery. Okay, so the one thing that I'm going to say about here is that when people come into a stress lab, there's a lot of subjectiveness to it. So we're putting them all through the same tasks, but some people get really motivated by these tasks, so they really want to perform well. Other people don't. And so that's always a worry. And so the one thing I wanted to try to do was to try to standardize the stressor in some way. So how do you make people experience the exact same stress? And one way to do it is to give them a physical stressor. So you make sure that the insult is identical across the board. And so we do this by injuring people. So again, this is not the nicest thing to do, but this is a kinder, friendlier version of wounding people. So in the standard wounding study, what we do is we actually do a punch biopsy of someone's skin, take like a hole puncher and take a chunk of their skin out, have them come back every day, take a picture of it, see how quickly they're healing. So we know that something like psychological stress, for example, might make you heal slower. So that hole is going to be bigger for longer. And what this really is it's a marker of your immune function. The better your immune function, the faster you heal. And one thing that we can do to do this a little bit friendlier is instead of ripping a hole out of your arm, is we can use magic tape, so just like the kind of tape you use to wrap a present, and we put it on your arm, and we rip it off, and we do that about 50 times. So it's not pleasant, but it's more like an Indian burn instead of, a giant chunk of your skin coming out. So it's a friendlier version. And what we can do is we can see we can measure objectively how much water you're losing from your skin, because one of the major functions of skin is keep the water stuff inside, keep the bad stuff outside. And so we can standardize how much liquid you're losing as a marker of objectively, how injured are you. In this case, we had about 50 participants. They came in for about 3 hours. We used the PANIS this time, but we had the expanded version, which has a little bit more detail. And then we tape strip them from between 6 to 51 times. So there's a wide variety in how long it takes or how difficult it is to get people to that same injury level, but we control for that. And we use these water probes, which is a $10,000 fancy piece of equipment, which basically just put on it tells you how much water you're losing from that area. So then we look at, 3.5 hours later, how healed are you? And the nice thing with tape stripping is that people heal within the day. It doesn't take them a week to heal like with the punch biopsy study. So we can do this in the course of a few hours. Okay, so like I said, we use these water meter probes, and we damaged them until they had an equal amount of water loss. We used 3 different sites so we could average across the 3 different sites, and then measured their water retention levels at 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and 120 minutes after we disrupted them, starting about 35 minutes after the actual injury. And this is what we see. So the people in yellow are 1 standard deviation above the average level of trait positive affect. So this was how are you typically. And what you're seeing is that at about 1 hour, the people who are more positive had about 40% healing, all the way up to almost 50%. The people who were the 1 standard deviation below the average on positive affect, they were only about 20% healed at 1 hour and only made it up to about 30% by the time the study was over. So pretty substantial change. Again, no relationship of negative emotion with skin barrier recovery. And like I said before, this wasn't due to any differences in skin function. So it wasn't due to the fact that some people had really bad skin function to begin with, because not only was that wasn't associated with positive or negative affect. If we controlled for it, it wasn't actually there. Okay, and I don't actually have a slide for it, but not too surprising again. We actually do find the same thing with activation levels. The trick with the PANIS is that PANIS is all activated emotion. And so we did see significant effects across the board. But the one that seemed to be showing the most benefit was the one that had sort of the excitement piece to it. So it wasn't just feeling aroused. It was feeling sort of positive excitement that seemed to be driving this association. Okay. So another way that this could be happening is via health behaviors. I have an entire other lecture on health behaviors that I could tell you about if you're curious. Very complicated story. But there may be some specific health behaviors that are sort of battery recharging, things that we think would be really good for you when you're stressed out. If you're having a bad day at the office, what is the best thing for you to do? Well, there's certain activities that we can imagine might be especially helpful. And like I said, this is comparable to the sort of broaden and build theory, talking about these buildings of resources that might be important. So we developed a scale in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Enjoyable Activities Test. Just got published about, I think this month actually. And we looked at activities that we specifically thought would be important for sort of making you feel peaceful or invigorated, reducing your negative emotion, reducing your stress, and recharging your batteries. And we have it's a 10-item scale. I can show you the scale at the end if you're curious. But it has things like how often do you take vacation, how often do you spend time in nature, do you go to religious ceremonies, do you socialize with others, do you have a hobby, or even do you just spend some time at the end of the day just taking time to unwind, some quiet time, which I know is very hard for people because they're constantly checking their BlackBerries or checking their email. You don't have that quiet, peaceful time anymore. And the way that this differs from most health behavior studies is that people tend to focus on one usually. So they're interested in exercise, so they just look at exercise. And they assume if you're not exercising, that's bad. Or they just look at vacations, which we know is associated with things like mortality, and they assume if you're not taking a vacation, that's bad. But the reality of it is that not everyone likes all types of leisure. Some people like going to church. Some people really don't like going to church. Some people like spending time with others. Some people don't. And so we thought it was really important to get a measure that was sort of cumulative time devoted to leisure. How much time are you devoting to recharging your batteries instead of just looking at one typical activity, how often you're spending time on that? Because again, people have different preferences. And in this very study, we had a big chunk of people who don't like going to religious ceremonies, but they were doing lots of other things. Okay, so this is a sample of about 1,400 people from 4 large studies in Pittsburgh for various purposes. The studies had both healthy and diseased populations. And in this case, I apologize. This is actually supposed to say the PEAT, the Pittsburgh Enjoyable Activities Test. It was originally called the RAFT, the Restorative Activities Frequency Test, but our reviewers made us change it because we couldn't prove that it was restorative because it wasn't an experimental study. So they made us change the name of it. Anyway, we think it's assessing restorative activities, so just keep that in mind. So the PEAT was associated with an array of health-relevant measures. We controlled for possible confounds, socioeconomic status, their race, their age, their sex. Socioeconomic status turns out to be something particularly important here because if you don't have time, if you don't have money, you can't go on a vacation. You can't take a yoga class. I mean, this is a big issue, and we can talk about that as well at the end, but it's certainly something we considered very carefully. So as far as positive emotion goes, we would expect that it would be more strongly associated with these activities because these are positive activities that are particularly important for buffering stress. And if it really is the case that positive emotion plays this really important role in sort of reducing that stress response, we would really want to see that effect there. And so if you look at the relative betas, you do see that the positive emotion is more strongly associated with those activities. However, if you control for both of them in the same regression equation, you basically lose the negative emotion piece entirely. So if you include positive affect with negative, positive remains significant. If you include the negative with the positive, you lose it entirely. The significance drops down to 0.42. So it's just not there anymore. And again, that's not that surprising because when you're in a bad mood, you're not going to do these activities. If you're not feeling like you're in a bad mood, it's not going to make you do those things more. But maybe feeling like you're in a good mood, that will encourage you to go out there and do things that are good for you. As far as physiological outcomes, what we saw is that the people who engaged in more of these activities, they had smaller body mass indexes, so they were a little bit healthier as far as obesity goes. Their waist size was smaller. And the one thing I should say here is that we had exercise. Sports was one of the items. If you take that out of the equation, you still see the body mass index effect. So it's not just that these people are engaging in exercise all the time, and that's why you're seeing effects on their weight. It's something different than that. We see lower levels of cortisol, so that immune-suppressing hormone. We're seeing that those people who engage in more of these activities have lower levels. It seems it's particularly important for the social activities of the scale, so eating with your family, spending time with your friends. Those seem to be especially important for cortisol. And then finally, your resting blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, was lower if you're engaging in more of those activities. Again, if you control for the sports item, you get rid of that, you still see that effect. The really good news here, and again, this is cross-sectional, so we can't make any sort of interpretations about cause and direction of this. But what you're seeing here is a nice little interaction where when stress is high, so you have a lot of bad things happening, you get fired, you get divorced, you break up with your boyfriend, when bad things are happening, what you're seeing here is that the people who are high in positive emotion, they actually engage in more leisure as bad things happen, which is a really protective strategy, right? I mean, I think for most of us, when bad things happen, everything else goes out the window, right? You've got the paper you have to write, you stop sleeping, you stop exercising, you stop eating well, everything goes out the window. But it seems like if you engage in more of those activities, you end up getting less of the detriment. If you're engaging in more leisure, you actually experience less, I don't have this data there, but you actually experience less distress. So it's protecting you. It's helping you when you're experiencing this high stress levels. I think this is especially important, on a day-to-day level. We're constantly going through, these stressful events, and it's very easy to take a moment and just be restful or take a walk in a park. There's very simple strategies that might actually help us manage the stress by engaging these sort of battery recharging activities. Okay, now something interesting is, this idea, are these important for getting under the skin? So is it something about restorative activities that's helping positive emotion get under the skin to affect something like your blood pressure? And it turns out that yes, it is. If you actually control for the PEAT, control for those enjoyable activities, that the initial association between positive emotion and systolic blood pressure, actually you lose about 50% of its initial association. So it really does seem like these restorative activities are especially important at helping positive emotion get under your skin to influence your health. This is obviously cross-sectional, so again, the interpretability of this is limited, but I think it's definitely suggestive of an important way that that positive emotion might be getting to us, getting to our health. Okay, so what have we learned? Obviously, positive emotion associated with a whole wide array of health outcomes. We've got mortality outcomes, your likelihood of getting a cold, your likelihood of getting a disease, your symptoms, your pain reporting. It's also important to at least consider positive emotion. I mean, obviously, with these studies, we should, even if you're really interested in stress, you're really interested in anxiety as your outcome, you should at least be considering it, because you might think nothing is going on there, whereas really it's the absence of positive emotion that seems to be driving some of these health effects. Similarly, in some cases, positive emotion might be better. So, even if it's, even if you really think that anxiety is important, it might be anxiety plus not being happy, plus not feeling vigor. That, there's something else going on here with the positive emotion that might be particularly important, since in a bunch of these studies that I showed you, the negative affect wasn't really doing much at all, counter to what we would normally expect. Obviously, positive emotion was predicting a lot of physiological outcomes. We've got cortisol, we've got stress, cortisol and blood pressure and so forth. And these seem to be independent of a lot of potential confounds, social relationships, negative affect, optimism. And in this data, it really seemed to be these energized positive words that, in almost every case, that's what was driving it. It wasn't feeling calm. It was feeling energized, feeling activated. And that's not because of their health. It's because of something about feeling this energy and enthusiasm that seems to be especially important. And one thing we could talk about once we get to the sort of discussion questions is how much of that is cultural. How much of it is it that Americans, we're not really trained to focus on our calm. We don't take mindfulness retreats and meditation retreats. We go on roller coaster rides and bungee jumping. And that maybe we're just not paying attention to our calm, and it's really more of a measurement issue as opposed to calm not being good for us. So we can definitely talk about that, because I think it's a really interesting and important question, given the sort of focus on complementary medicine and all these sort of yoga interventions and things like that. Positive emotion seems to be obviously particularly crucial in the stress response. It seems to be associated with both lowering stress hormones and with reactivity and recovery. Obviously very important. Stress is essential, especially for all of you people here who are dealing with businesses. Stress is sort of constant, rampant, really bad. So this really gives us some very good reason to focus on positive psych, because it really does seem to be particularly important in helping people both manage how they react to the stress and how they get over the stress in the first place. Obviously there's this sort of idea that maybe these restorative health behaviors might be especially crucial. And, not necessarily that hard to change. Those things are going to be a lot easier to move around possibly, as opposed to positive emotion, which we'll get to in a minute. So where do we go? Obviously, there's a lot of issues still that we have to look at, like these active components. Is it really vigor? Is it a cultural issue? I've only done a handful of studies doing this. We obviously need more evidence to really, wipe out some of these other possible alternative explanations, test the mediators, what it really is that's getting under the skin. But, certainly the evidence so far is promising and consistent, which is what you like to see. Okay, so the million-dollar question, obviously, is this, which is, can we actually increase positive emotion in a meaningful way that, at the cross-sectional level, it's going to improve your health, so you'll see, stress hormone differences, blood pressure differences as you're going through an intervention. And more importantly, if we did some kind of follow-up, can we see decreased sick days down the line, decreased colds, staying out of the hospital, getting fewer diseases, which again, would make a very potential, real important difference to the health of the country, the health of businesses, whoever your population is, if you can really do this in a meaningful way. And we can also look at, is it decreasing stress reactivity? Is it improving their recovery, physiological function, and so forth? There's a lot of different outcomes we could look at here, which fortunately, people are starting to do, and some of my own research, we're really trying to do this right now. However, we have a few things working against us. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the hedonic adaptation theory that says you win a lottery, happiness goes up, go right back down to where you were before, get into a bad accident, lose the use of your legs, you have a drop in your positive emotion, goes right back up to where you were before. And if that kind of meaningful event can't change your happiness for more than a few months, what hope do we have for interventions having a long-term impact on our health? But the positive psych movement is really on this. There's a lot of, loving kindness, gratitude, forgiveness. There's a lot of different activities that people can do. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with many of these things that seem to be having real benefits on positive affect outcomes. However, most of them are pretty short-term. Most of these studies just look for a few weeks after the intervention, maybe a few months after the intervention. However, that might have a real health effect, and we just don't know yet. It's possible that you only need to have a few months of effect, especially if you're doing this in the context of a disease. So I've got early-stage cancer, or I'm a cancer survivor. Maybe a few months of being more positive is all I need to really get my immune system up and going again. But we really don't know. The research just isn't there yet. But definitely something that myself and hopefully a lot of other people will start looking at. Okay. Additional issues. How does it matter how we increase positive emotion? Do we need to be focusing on vigor, since that seems to be the active ingredient? Again, it's an empirical question. We need to be really looking at that in the research. And then, do we need to target positive emotion specifically, or can we focus on certain mediators? For example, getting people to take more vacations, getting them to spend more time outside, and so forth. And then finally, this issue, which I talk about a lot with my clinical colleagues, is, is it enough to reduce the negative emotion? So in clinical work, it's almost entirely focused on getting rid of the negative feelings, so getting rid of your depressed feelings, getting rid of your stress feelings, and not necessarily going further and increasing the positive. And it's a question of when does that make a health difference? Is it enough to just get rid of the negative and bring them to neutral, or do you need to get it further? Do you need to get these people positive? And again, it's a question that hasn't really been looked at yet, but I think it's an important one. And then I just kind of threw together a slide which said, what does this mean for positive organizational scholarship? And I think the answer is a lot. This obviously has a real important bottom line, which is that not only can positive organizations lead to happier places to work, more effective places, more profitable places, but the health outcomes, things that might be associated with, having a happier place to work could be very monetarily important. Things like fewer sick days, less disease morbidity. You can throw off the insurance costs if people aren't getting sick as often. Workplace stress is obviously going to be associated with a lot of negative health outcomes. If you can get that dropping, obviously a lot of you have already worked on that kind of question, but maybe doing it specifically with positive psych interventions could be especially fruitful. And obviously there's that cross-sectional effect, which is if you get these people healthier, they're going to feel more happy, and that's going to pass on to their work. So it's going to work both directions. Okay, a note to leave on. So J.D. Salinger said, I am a paranoiac in reverse. I suspect people of plotting to make me happy. And I think this is something we should all be doing, is plotting to make people happy, because it really does seem to have some very important health effects and really some potentially exciting effects on our bodies. Obviously have tons of people to thank, so just glance at their names, but all my various colleagues who helped me with these studies and the different institutions that have been involved, Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh, very nice building if you haven't seen it, the Cathedral of Learning, the Gallup organization, and KU, obviously, which is where I am now. And that's it. Thank you. Questions? Discussion. I want to hear everything. Kim. Mm-hmm. In my data, at least.
Sure. And we assume your studies are valid and reliable.
Yes.
And so that seems to fly in the face of all the research on stress. And, there's an enormous sort of overloaded emphasis on reduced stress, therapies for stress, get rid of unhappy people,
Right. So there's a few different ways for me to answer that question. So the one more related to what you just said is that, like I said, so some portion of measuring depression is the absence of positive. So it's not just the presence of negative, it's the absence of positive. And what a few studies have done when they do those analyses of taking the positive words out of the depression scale and comparing them to the negative, in those same studies where they are sometimes looking at depressed populations, it's the absence of the positive that's driving some of the health benefits. So that's actually been shown, like that population with the HIV, and I think they've done one with heart disease now as well, that it's in depressed patients, it's the absence of the positive that seems to be driving some of these health outcomes. Now, that being said, as far as my own studies go, I'm typically looking at healthy populations. A lot of the studies on the negative attributes of stress and hostility and negative emotion, they're looking at sick patients. They're looking at patients with, unbelievable amounts of stress. They look at post-traumatic patients and so forth. And so they're looking at patients that are already likely to have very high, seriously detrimental levels of stress. Whereas in my studies of like healthy undergrads, for example, on the average day, their stress is not like an adult with, heart disease risk factors and so forth, and the sort of stress of not being able to pay your mortgage as opposed to not being able to buy that iPod. It's a very different sort of, piece in terms of how important it is. So some of it is sample, but that being said, the longevity study with the psychologists, nothing was stress in that study. The study of the healthy older women with the cardiovascular reactivity, the stress is associated with some things, but stress wasn't associated with their reactivity in that case, and that's, pretty telling. And I think it's just the fact that a lot of these studies over the last 100 years don't measure positive. They don't get at it, and so without having it there, we just don't know what was going on. The vigor, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm working on a cancer intervention right now, and as far as we're concerned, the only way to get at vigor in the literature, exercise. And that's the only thing that, there hasn't been a psychological intervention that reported at least a benefit to vigor. And so, it's definitely something that needs a lot of work is, can we do this without making them exercise? Because in some populations, you can't make them exercise because their health won't allow for it. But that being said, even moderate walking can actually increase vigor, so it doesn't take much. Yeah. Use stress. So in the average life event scale, where it's like 100 items and you just kind of indicate what are the stressful things that happen, they include positive events like getting married and moving and getting a new job. Turns out that those are actually pretty bad for your immune system too, because even though it's tinged with a happy sort of note to it, it's still very energy intensive. There's often bad things that happen in the midst of a positive thing. I mean, I could tell you stories about my wedding. Happy event, but family drama. So I think there's no perfectly positive stressful event. That being said, positive stress on the daily basis, which is sort of like you're engaged at work and you're sort of happy about what you're doing, that really has been shown to only have very moderate reactivity effects. So it's very short term and doesn't seem to be really bad for you at all. So in the short term, it's okay to have positive stressful events. In the long term, with the major ones, actually isn't so good for you. At least not to have a lot of them. I saw a hand over there, yeah? Right, there's like laughter yoga. Yeah.
So does it have to be genuine? Because I mean, with some of it, it's like, this is really genuine laughter.
Well, I mean, there's the whole, have you heard of the facial feedback hypothesis, which is this argument that when our face portrays a certain emotion, it sends signals back to our brain and makes us feel that way. So there's been a few studies doing that. I'm actually doing some work on that right now. So that would actually argue that fake would actually be okay. However, I know there was a study in your world, in the business world, that actually showed that if you make salespeople show fake smiles all the time, that actually makes them feel worse. So I think it's a mixed message. But, I mean, the issue is I'm not completely willing to write off all of the calm stuff anyway. I mean, certainly we've seen lots of benefits from mindfulness research and yoga research and so forth. And the issue is we don't know if it's making them feel more vigorous and energetic, because certainly some people would say that their mindfulness does make them more attentive, more aware, more energized. It just hasn't been tested because people usually use a scale that's very general and they don't look at the components. But that very well could be energizing them. We just don't know. I mean, we think it's calming because when you do it, it's calming. But, what's the long-term repercussion of that? And, recharging your batteries like that could really, amplify your energy in the rest of your day. Yeah. Oh, great. Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions I have, I'm really excited about the research because how can we use increasing positive affect as medicine necessary?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question. Did everyone hear that? It's how do we get medical insurance companies to believe that increasing positive affect is something they should be paying for, essentially, right? Because clinical clinicians are really starting to use positive psych, but if a doctor gave a prescription, go do some positive psych, I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, the insurance company is going to laugh them out of the building, probably. And I think it's stuff like this. I mean, we need some really large-scale epidemiological studies showing that clinical positive psych interventions are actually showing improved longevity. And I mean, really bottom line money stuff like pain medication, how long they're in the hospital. And I mean, the work I'm doing right now, we're actually doing it with an insurance company, with a company that advises insurance companies. And they're basically telling us, okay, these are the outcomes that we want to see. If you can change them, we're going to buy into it. So we're trying. I think it's just a matter of getting the right outcomes that insurance companies actually care about. And quality of life isn't usually one of them. It's bottom line money things. Other questions? I forgot to show you my Gallup data. I have some really exciting data basically showing that the positive emotion health connection exists across the world. And I must have just put it into a different set of slides, but I really wanted to show you that. But I mean, just basically showing that this isn't just a North American phenomenon. I mean, if you look at Zimbabwe, impoverished, sub-Saharan African countries where they have far worse things to worry about, like hunger and war and not having shelter, you still see this connection there. the positive emotion health connection is still there, even if you control for hunger, if they've gone hungry in the last year and so forth. And it turns out to be even stronger than the effects of going hungry. So it's really powerful, yeah. Right. Could they keep it up forever? Yeah. Well, I mean, so the evidence is mixed. I mean, the amount of genetic heritability of positive emotion, the studies are a little bit variable. Some say something like 50, some say something like 80% is heritable. There's only been like 3 studies, though, so it's hard to take too much stock in that. I mean, if you go with Sonja Liebermersky's research, she says that I think we have 40% movable stuff within positive emotion. Everything else is set. And so we've got 40% where we can do things like loving kindness and writing and gratitude, interventions and so forth. And, if we get that like maxed out, you're still going to be fighting against whatever your genetic and contextual factors are doing. Like if you're poor and you have low education and a bad job and so forth, there's not much you can do if your race is predisposition to certain health problems and so forth. But that gives us room to move. But I think what you're saying, as far as, do you have to continue it? I think that's absolutely true. And I think that the issue is that with a standard intervention, most people, once they're done, they drop out of it. Once they don't have someone following them up, they don't have someone paying for it, the vast majority of people stop doing it. And I think part of it is it gets boring. So I think that, we need to figure out ways to keep these things sort of fresh and different. And, I'm sure there's some amount of individual difference variables, too, that are going to predict who's able to maintain it. The people who are getting the most out of the mindfulness are going to obviously keep it up for longer. And how do we, take the people who aren't getting something out of it? And so there is this argument for sort of personalized picking for what your intervention should be, and that, in these interventions, we want to make it as research clean as possible. So we want to give everyone the exact same thing, but maybe that's not really what we should be doing, because everyone's going to get something different out of a different intervention. And, gratitude might work for one person, loving kindness might work for another, exercise might work for another, and maybe we should be allowing for that individual difference variability, and we don't really do that right now, at least not in the research context, which I think, might be something that would have the sort of more long-term effects if you match what the person likes, what they get the most out of with, with what works for them. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, as far as it's associated with activated PA. Well, I mean, it's part of extroversion, really. It's, part of being extroverted is being sociable with high activated emotion. Has anyone separated it out? I mean, I've separated it out a little bit in my studies. I don't do any really thorough, like 100-item personality scales. We usually do like 20-item, very brief ones. And we see them to be relatively independent. That being said, I mean, there's a lot of studies out there showing extroversion as a pretty potent predictor of better health. And you've got to imagine that, some of that is that positive emotion piece of it driving it. But they've also got the sociability, and we know the social relationships are going to be good. So it's almost arguing for that being like the best possible health profile you could have. But the trick is, how do you make someone extroverted? And you can't. I mean, if someone's not extroverted, you're not going to move them on that factor. So it's kind of an unfortunate outcome as far as interventions are concerned. Kim? Oh, really?
Yeah, so the positivity is behavioral trait or activity, attribute, capability, whereas the extroversion person is personality or temperament. So they would argue there are behaviors or capabilities.
Oh, so you can move positive energy around pretty easily. Well, that's really, I need to look at that research, because that, I mean, it just sounds like such a perfect match there. And if you can increase those behaviors, maybe moving vigor up in a meaningful way for a more lasting way, I mean, that could be a really awesome intervention. Anything else? Well, thank you.